Hi, this is Gertrude and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
This is my monthly video Patreon AMA. Anyone who wants to ask a question, donate $10 or more. All of those tiers from $10 and above can ask a question, assuming it's appropriate, assuming it's interesting enough, and it will be asked in one of these episodes. So Scott K says, of all the third position players, who do you think was or is currently the best? By this, I mean a Cajun B type. So I'll try and link to the video he's referring to if I can. It's about basically the roles in Counter-Strike, and not roles in the sense of like a League of Legends sense, but in terms of how you balance out a team, how you create a roster, the dynamics that have to take place within a squad in terms of how supportive they are, how good they are at fragging, how much a star player, how much of a role player, etc. All these components. So within that concept, the basic explanation is just as in a sport like basketball, you have traditionally the center, power forward, small forward, shooting guard, and point guard. And in football, traditionally they use the 4-4-2 formation with 2 strikers, 4 midfielders, 2 of them being wingers, 4 defenders, 2 being wings again as defenders, left back, right back, and a goalie. But you can obviously run a different formation in football. If you're in the NBA, you can have a team like, classic examples would be like the Spurs and Rockets teams of Olajuwon and Duncan, who realistically were more like really skilled power forwards than they were centers in some ways. They blurred the lines of it. So actually the player he mentions here, Cajun B, is one of my classic examples of exactly this type of player. In the old school TSM teams of 2015, you're looking at Device is the best player, Dupree's one of the best players, Cajun B is slightly behind them, those are the 2 stars, and in this particular example, he's obviously more on the fragging side of the equation. If you go to some other teams in history, maybe the person who's the third position player is more on the defensive side of the equation. I'd say maybe Vitality last year, they didn't really even have 2 stars most of the time in that team, right? It was almost like 2 or 3 third position players and 1 star in Ziwu. So historically, Cajun B himself is basically an archetypal player for that role. I think, let's just go with some of the great teams. If you want to go 2018 Astralis, the best team ever. I think personally in that team, Magisk was more of that role, was arguably the best ever at that role if you want to pick someone out. If you look at the strength of the team and his own individual strength, a lot of people obviously thought he was the second best player in the team after Device. I personally thought it was Dupree that year. And then last year, I thought it was Magisk and it was Dupree swapping around. So Dupree himself, I would say last year, somewhat played that role and obviously had events where he was an MVP. I think last year's Team Liquid, I would put Naf in that role because Elige was consistently the best player for me. For most of the period, we're talking about the summer. Twist was a monster. But then Naf was that really solid third player who provided big fragging. Obviously, could be a superstar fragger. If you want to go even further back in history, classic Virtus Pro. When they initially came on the scene and won their major, the best players were in this order. Probably Snacks overall, but Bialy was definitely not the best player. It was actually Pasha who was up there with Snacks as a monster and was someone that people thought obviously could be an MVP of events. His AWPing back then was pretty strong. So Bialy for me was a very strong third position player in that respect. Obviously we know that Virtus.pro certainly could frag, and within their team you had to run a little bit of the tactics as well, right? They always had their own approach to that. I think if you want to go back to the old school NIP, we're talking Get Right and Forest at the beginning of CSGO, you'd probably say Freiburg was a very strong third position player in that regard. One of the best fraggers in the game at the time, but he's behind arguably the 2 best players in the game. I think if you go to some of the old school Very Games teams, the ones that had Shocks and Scream, for me, NBK was a phenomenal third position player in that regard. So most of the great teams have a person you could pick out in this regard. I actually think at the moment it's interesting because the top 10 is so messed up. I look at the top 10 right now. I think another factor as to why the results are so variable is you have to look really hard to find a team that's even got 2 real star players in it in Europe right now. So I think for 2 examples of people who I think are good and are maybe in contention for best in this regard, I picked out 2. I've picked out Art from Furia, because I think if you want to look at pure fragging and pure like traditional star player role, I think you pretty much have to give it to Yuri and Keserato. They're monsters on that team. But then after that, Art is an incredible impact player. He obviously can himself carry the game. He's much more on the aggressive side of the equation as opposed to the team plus side. But even then, he almost is like a role player in how he creates space. I think he's doing a fantastic job. He's a very good player regardless of role. But in the context of Fury, I think he's doing a fantastic job in that sense. And then I also thought, how about another top team who came up more recently? So let's say from big, I'll say Sirison plays that role. For me, the star player overall in big is between Xantares and Tabson. I think Tabson is the better player, but Xantares might be the better overall fragger. They're both really strong fraggers. So the idea that Searson's going to be your AWPer and then doesn't necessarily have to carry the game hard like those other two because he's got those players. Again, I think one of the better fraggers from the third position, one of the players who deserves to be put in that category. But I do think actually this year there haven't been as many that were really good in the historically great sense. Matrim says, what/who are some historical events or figures that you find particularly interesting? Thanks for your time. Right, he obviously again means non-esports. So, let me think how to answer this. I mean, if I have to think for too long, then it can't be that significant. So I'll just say some people that just come to mind from books I read or interested. Obviously, I'm quite interested in many people who have a hermetic or occult background, mainly because it was fairly secret, and to even find information about them, you have to know the right authors to read and write books that actually until the 20th century you would have had a real hard time getting a hold of, or maybe they would be incredibly exorbitantly priced, but in the modern day, you can either buy them, you can buy them secondhand anywhere in the world thanks to the internet, or you can potentially acquire them through other methods. So certainly there's a lot of great occult figures I'm very interested in. Classical examples would be people like Isaac Newton, etc., Paracelsus, and these are some classics you can go to. Nostradamus is one you can throw in there. I think if you want one that people maybe wouldn't be as familiar with, Dr. John Dee is a very interesting character. I recommend most of Francis Yates' books, by the way, about Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, etc. I think she did some great work there. Crucially, didn't put too much editorial in. She kind of put together the pieces that she found. Let me think along similar lines. I think actually one that would probably, just this is an interesting one if anyone wants to look into someone very, very obscure, would be a guy called Charles Fort, who had some very unique sort of occult ideas. Like he was a guy who thought, for example, that planets had their own, or heavenly bodies, however he might have phrased it, had their own sort of like soul or spirit, and that basically they would sort of like reach out and they could somehow like contact other ones or something, almost as though they had communication with each other. So a very unusual thinker. I think he's like a 19th century thinker from what I remember. The guy, again, if you find anything about that guy, some really interesting stuff there. In terms of like events, the problem is a lot of the great ones in history seem really sexy until you actually look into it. So in terms of like historical events I'm interested in, I'm not actually that interested in stuff like World War II or like the Roman period, all that classic shit that people like to go to. I'm quite interested in like ancient Greece, just because actually some of the people who were the great thinkers, philosophers, writers from that time, I just find them very lucid to read even to this day. Like, I find that actually they seem to have, I wouldn't say similar values at all, but I'd say they have certain mental concepts in place that are still vital enough to this day that they give you like that you can relate to or you can resonate with what they're talking about. Like that actually seems like it could just be you thousands of years in the past with a slightly different background thinking about ideas you might think about now. I would even argue actually I think 20th century and further on, a lot of the intellectuals seem quite deranged and decadent, and yeah, I think they just sort of, I think that's an area that's somewhat decayed in many ways in terms of like traditional historical academics in that regard, not obviously random people writing books who might be very interesting in their own regard. So there's a few for you. In terms of figures, I like all the people basically who, I mean, maybe not like, but I'm interested in people who are either great artists or, forget the art side, just did great things and therefore the process of how they did it. So for example, I find like Napoleon a very interesting character. I think he's got a lot of unique, compelling, clearly flawed elements to his character. I think he was a really interesting guy. Barbara Stanwyck's Legs says, over the last few years, you've mentioned your growing interest in American football. Are there particular writers you enjoy most for reading about it? Right, I will say up front, no. So if anyone out there actually thinks they have some really good writers, feel free to recommend them. I will say, in general, my position on sports writing, it's quite similar to my thoughts on esports writing, which is, and this isn't just because of the industry, but I actually think it's mad underwhelming. Like, one of the reasons I have been so interested in esports writing myself and continue to write in esports is there's so few people write things I want to read or about the topics I'm interested in. So in similar sense, when I've gone into the sports world, I find it even worse than esports in many regards. Or if there is someone interesting, they're locked away on some obscure blog somewhere or some forum somewhere. Like in basketball, you had the occasional interesting person like Zach Lowe. Even then, some of his stuff I thought just went way too into that. If you know esports, you might get this reference. He seemed too much like the sort of people who were in that sort of analysis/lol esports writing cadre where they're all just like memeing each other all the time, and like half the shit of their work is actually degraded by the fact that they're putting too many in-jokes and silly references and stupid narratives that they've come up with that aren't even interesting or like compelling. It's just like stuff that should really be staying inside like a WhatsApp group or something, but it bleeds into their work. So even then I have a lot of skepticism about a lot of those people. So quite frankly, there aren't any writers I found particularly good. Like I found they're all either just boneheads who say stuff like, "Regard the most Super Bowl, you're the best one ever." It's like that level of thinking, which to me is not thinking. Or it's people where, again, they're obscure people on blogs, and I've only been able to find the odd article by like Googling. If I actually look up stuff like the PFF guys, Pro Football Focus, I find that they're the equivalent of the HLTV guys who just pick a few metrics and just go way too deep on that and let the number tell them what they think about the game, not their eyes and their brain. In fact, they'll let the number overwrite what they think. I think sometimes they come up with some interesting principles or theories, like some of their ideas about whether running backs win the game for you or who you should draft. Some of that's interesting. But actually, yeah, like I say, I just don't find there are that many good writers. So if anyone's got some good people out there, don't just name them. Name them, put a link in the comments section when I post this. On Patreon, obviously. Maybe even give a reason as to why, or a great piece they wrote, and maybe me, or quite frankly, maybe other people as well will want to check it out. Maybe I'll check it out. Maybe we'll all check it out. We'll see. Shantanu Pawar says, "You touched on Christopher Nolan's movies a bunch of times before. What do you think are his limitations? I feel his greatness is confined within non-linear / time and sci-fi genre. I was really hoping Dunkirk, a defined historical event with no wiggle room for fiction, would break that trend, but was disappointed to see the movie take the same turn." I don't think that I don't know if that's a limitation personally, because I think that's a very effective style of how to do a movie, actually. I mean, there's a reason why Quentin Tarantino, I think, has made a lot of, being very critically acclaimed for that style of movie. I think it's just more interesting to a lot of common cinema goers in the modern day. And critics, if they like it, are going to declare that you're the best. So I think it's obvious as to why that formula exists. I think it's just that once you master a certain style and have certain strengths, you tend to play to those. Like, you don't intend to, with every movie, go for broke on some other new style. Certain people do, like the Orson Welles of the world, but they're just incredible artists. Like, a lot of people, remember, it's their job as well. They also want to make money. They want to have success. They want to have continued success. They don't want to have a couple of massive budget movies that flop. So they're going to stick to their strengths. So I personally don't see it as a limitation. I don't really know why this is an issue for you, or why it seems to me, I'll just be straight up with you, it seems to me that you don't like Christopher Nolan very much, or you think he's overrated, and so you want me to tell you or agree with you as to why he's overrated, which I'm not going to do. So if you want to know his limitations, I would say he does have one very striking limitation for me, and it's one that I was always underwhelmed, that as somebody who actually is a massive aficionado of Christopher Nolan movies and movies in general, I did find it underwhelming that so few people who really like his movies ever seem to acknowledge it, which is that I think many of his movies are too long. Like, I certainly love it when a movie's really good and it lasts 2 or 3 hours, but he's had a couple of movies. The most notable ones for me, the two I would pick out, would be The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, where I feel like the last act of both of these movies falls quite flat, doesn't really like hit the kind of very high notes and big resonances that the rest of the movie did. Like, for me, those movies are really good for the first 2/3, and then the last third is just kind of like, what? And then it just falls apart. Like, for me, the whole part where, spoilers, Batman's in what we think is the Bane pit. For me, the part where, like, they're running Gotham, I found that, like, really not interesting. And the way it ends, that movie, I found very unsatisfying. Basically, both those movies, I feel like, realistically, if you edit them down, I think they would be much stronger movies. And I feel as though some of the things that happen in the third act almost should have been part of a different movie. It's like you tried to cram 2 movies into one. I think that's his biggest limitation, personally. Like, I didn't have any problems with Dunkirk. I thought it was a pretty good movie. I'll even take, actually, umbrage with the way you say that Dunkirk was a defined historical event with no wiggle room for fiction. Let's just be straight up here and put all our cards on the table. I don't care at all about historical accuracy in movies. I do think it's a problem because even I do watch movies that are historical and then think that I know some of the history as a result, but that's just ignorance. You shouldn't talk on topics you haven't researched and looked into aside from just as idle conversation, right? So what I would say is this. I don't think movies have to be at all accurate to what happened. I think you can take a lot of artistic license to make the story better. I definitely think, by the way, if you want to have fun with it, you can just change what happened. The great example here I would give, against spoilers, would be Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards. If anyone's watched that movie, that ain't how it happened, by the way, guys. Some of the very key things at the end of that movie are not things that happened in real life, to my knowledge. So I didn't have a problem with that, though. I thought, whoa, this is a brave move to do that. That's kind of cool, though, right? Because, I mean, it is a fantasy world. He can recreate it however he wants and do it, and he can change the ending if he wants. So I personally don't think that that's an issue. Like, if you didn't find Dunkirk interesting, fair enough. I found it a pretty good movie. I didn't think it was his best movie. I didn't think it was even one of his best. But I thought it was pretty compelling. It was worth a watch, certainly. The NA Kerfuffle says, so here's the thing, Thorin. In regards of LCS importing players, I believe it is a poisoned chalice. Here's why I think this is the case. You can just skip that part, by the way, and just tell me. Upon research, I came across an interesting statistic. C9 has not picked up an import player that at least played one split on a different team in NA before joining Cloud9. Furthermore, C9 has a great record of developing NA talent. Let me see. So the conclusion I kept, by the way, just so I can get it out there at the beginning, that is factually wrong. Because think about it, mate. Like, they have Sven, and Sven already played, like, 2 years, 4 splits on TSM. So that's actually not accurate, but whatever. Aside from those ones, so yes, obviously when they brought in people like Impact, it's also not true either, mate. Like, they also had Rosh, who played for Tip before. That certainly applies to Jensen / Incarnation. So, okay, it applies to a couple of high-profile names. So the conclusion I came to was the following. C9 is so successful because they built the groundwork to succeed by letting other organizations test imports for them while focusing on their own region's talents. Do you agree with this sentiment? Why or why not? Right, first of all, I personally think the whole C9 develops NA talent is a really overblown angle. Like, I'll give them massive props for what they did bringing them through Licorice and Zazel, but then I'll immediately also mention only Licorice remains. Zazel they already sold. Is he the best support? No. Then you go, look, who else have they developed in terms of NA talent? If you're going to say the original team, that's a very unfair angle, because when they came in the LCS, I believe there was one import player. I think it was just Edward Uncurse. I think he's the only import player in the whole league at the time, except, I believe, people like Nijaki, or maybe, I mean, it's possible even Xmithy, maybe, I don't know, some sort of visa issues, I don't know. So it's possible in that scenario. So I think it's a really overblown angle. Like, in the modern day, who have they developed? Like, Licorice, yeah. Zazel, okay. Have they developed Vulcan? Have they? Fuck. He was already on Clutch and a whole bunch of teams before. Have they developed Blabber? Oh, I guess actually Blabber should count in there as well. You know, in the same way as Licorice does, Blabber counts to us. Okay, they've got a couple. Yeah, I'll give you that they've got a couple that they developed. And obviously so few other teams have been able to develop NA talent. Yeah, I can somewhat give you that. So I don't think personally that's why their success came along. Like, I think, for example, in the end, bringing in Niski, I actually think wouldn't have brought them the championship, except that they then were able to integrate Blabber as a result of having Niski. If they'd have still had Jensen, in my opinion, Blabber and Jensen would not have been a good pairing. Or at least they wouldn't have been on the level that Niski and Blabber are. So I think actually, much like every great team, it's a mixture of like luck, planning, and then you just need certain variables that you don't really control either way, like a player to level his game up or a player to fit the meta properly. Similarly, like Sven without Vulcan, I feel like both those players would be worse without each other. In fact, I actually think if you look at the moment, aside from... No, actually, I can't even really think of a support in the NA region who would be really good playing with Sven, aside from maybe Core JJ. And even then I get the sense that Sven's more the leader, so maybe you wouldn't want Core JJ leading him. Like, I don't think, for example, I think he'd hate playing with people like Ignar, no matter what you might say. I don't think he would enjoy playing with Biofrost or Treats, etc. Maybe he would Treats, actually, if I don't know who's the leader in that dynamic, though. So I think what happens is, I once heard someone describe this very well. It was actually the guy Scott Adams, who is the cartoonist behind Dilbert. And he often says that, like, explaining things doesn't really do anything. Like, when you give analogies or explain, all you tend to do is you just say, this thing happened in the past, and here are the reasons I want to believe are the case, but I have no way of testing it, and I'm just going to say that. So I'm just going to make up essentially a reason as to why what I'm saying is correct. I think that's what most of us do with great teams. Once they win, we just come up with the reasons why. So, for example, remember on Team Liquid, it was nothing about NA talent, right? And they've had more success than Cloud9. So for them, it was about what? It was about them getting the best imports, is what them spending the most money. When they had TSM, what was their angle? Was it NA talent? Was it import? No, it was about having Bjergsen, keeping Bjergsen, building around Bjergsen, rebuilding, getting new talents. I mean, there's a whole bunch of angles you can go with. So I think it's an interesting proposition. At least you did a good job laying out the question. I don't think there's as much to it, though. I think the correlation, in my opinion, is fairly weak. And I think they have, compared to other NA orgs, done a good job developing talent. But I don't think that's why they're the best necessarily. Because actually, the interesting thing for me is I don't think their imports are as crazy as they could be. Like, I actually think if you look at who's available in Europe, you could obviously get a better mid and AD carry than Sven and Niski. So if you put better AD carry than Sven and Niski onto a team like Team Liquid or TSM right now, I mean, they might be the best team in NA. So would having Vulcan and Blabber and Licorice really help you at a point in time? It would help, but it wouldn't make you the best, right? See what I mean about why the explanation is not as simple? Anyway, you get my premise on that. I think it's a bit of an overblown angle. Spoonfed89. How impactful do you believe the coaches of teams have been during this period of online CS? Could they have contributed meaningfully to the topsy-turvy results? Right, I think by that, he is implying the fact that, like, there's no way to police. In fact, it's almost certain they were all doing this, and I think actually tournaments just allowed it. There's no way to stop coaches basically just being on the same call as the players, and therefore just essentially, if they wanted to, actually IGLing, like just calling the game, as it were, being the leader, or just giving info, etc. Now, obviously, on LAN, they wouldn't be able to do this. They'd have to talk during timeouts, except for rare events, etc. So how much do I think that would contribute? I think it contributes a bit. Like, I certainly could see your angle as to why that would, like, could help level up some of the lesser teams or even up the results. You're just getting more information, and therefore there's less pockets of space on the map where someone doesn't know anything, or someone called something but his teammate didn't listen, but he doesn't know it because he's too busy concentrating himself, but the coach hears it and repeats it or calls it for him, or there's a million different angles you can go. Yeah, I could see that having some player to do with it. I don't actually think in terms of as general coaches it's been that good, though, because teams have just been playing way too often. As far as I know, they also didn't get much scrim time even when they were at home now, except for the teams that just weren't in the big competitions. Everyone's been playing these tournaments that have like a billion fucking best of 3 series in them. So, and double elim brackets, etc. So I actually think coaches haven't had as much impact in that sense. I also think if they're there on LAN with them, in the hotel room with them, on buses with them, having dinners with them, I actually think in some ways that can be more effective as an opportunity to have a serious discussion with your team about issues and work through them. Whereas when you're at home, especially if you're all online and you're not in the same room, it can be a lot more difficult to run the meeting in that sense. It's one of the reasons why, even though now, obviously this year, all these companies are having to do meetings online, one of the reasons that I've been told in the past that companies don't like to do meetings online and up from home is you don't know which guy's alt-tabbed, you don't know which guy has a second monitor and is just watching fucking The Simpsons on it or something while you're trying to discuss something he's barely listening to you. Whereas if he's in person at the table in front of you, it's going to be way more difficult for him to do something like that. So I think they probably had some impact, but sadly not as much as you might imagine if you're just a fan just watching generally. Anders Pettersson says, in your opinion, who is the greatest Swedish CS player? Please choose one from the old days and one from recent time, since the game, tactics, team structure and economy have evolved so much. Right, so the shortlist is easy to make. There's 2 names for CS 1.6 and there's 2 names for CSGO. So in CS 1.6 or Counter-Strike, the old version, it's Forrest, probably the greatest Swedish player ever. If we're talking individual form, mixed with very good accomplishments, but not the best. In fact, nowhere near the best. If you want to go with strong individual form, but not necessarily the same individual titan, but amazing results, so we're talking more of the Tom Brady, like just sheer accomplishments forces you into the conversation, along with being a very good player, it's got to be Potty. For me, in fact, you could even divide 1.6. Make CS 1.6, so the first half of the 2000s, Potty's the best Swedish player. Second half of the 2000s, Forrest's the best Swedish player. Overall, I'd probably give the edge to Forrest. I don't put team accomplishments above everything else. I think Potty in many ways had as much help, or maybe more. CSGO, it's got to be Get Right, it's got to be Olaf Meister. And quite frankly, we're doing the same thing again, right? If it's the first couple of years of CSGO, it's easily Get Right. He was just the best player in CSGO those years. If we're talking the next couple of years, next year or so, it's probably Olaf Meister. Again, most people thought he was the best player in the whole game. I don't think anyone else is actually in the discussion, really. Like, there's definitely a lot of really great Swedish players in 1.6 and CSGO, and definitely great players as well, and players that have accomplished incredible things, sometimes individually very good players, but I think these are the players that have got the combo of the accomplishments, the consistency, the high peak, the incredible impact. Basically, their entire team's defined around how they played and their strengths, and they often were the player that won their teammates the championships and were the MVPs. I think these are the obvious names. If I have to pick one name for all of CS, then that's a tough one, actually, because I have a very strong bias to CS 1.6. Like, it's hard for me to even put Simple over some of the greatest 1.6 players still to this day. So I feel like probably Forest wins that overall, but it's Forest or Get Right are the two biggest candidates, because Get Right obviously was absolutely phenomenal for the last few years of CS 1.6, and then incredible for the first 2 years of CS Go. So I could go either way on that one, Forest or Get Right. I'd say probably overall Forest. If you want to talk about raw years of individual play, problem is if I'm going to be biased 1.6, I've got to give it Forest in that sense, haven't I? Soliko says, I've recently started watching Quake historical games. Is there any particular games you would advise someone to watch? There's a million. I'll probably do a feature like I did with that CS one where it was like 10 series every CS fan must watch or whatever. Maybe I'll do something similar for Quake, or 10 great Quake finals or something. Because it's not a very big topic, but it's one that I myself would like to look through the games and decide what my top 10 would be, etc. So for now, I've got two suggestions for you. One is there's a channel, I'll link it in the description box, assuming I remember. If I forget, someone put a comment. It's called Decibel01 US, as in 01 US. And this guy has so many sick Quake demos made into VODs that he's put onto his YouTube channel that you can just go and watch. And some of them, if they have commentary available. So you can get so much stuff, even from the modern day. Like I'm talking about, he has like the 2016 QuakeCon final on there, for example, between Evil and Rafa, which is a pretty good game. So I'd go there and watch a whole bunch of the classic Quake games, the modern Quake games. It's not like every game ever. It's mainly the big ones, or the classic ones, or the finals, or the great players playing each other. I would personally just suggest you do what I do with every game. Pick a couple of players, start watching games of them, find out which ones excite and interest you the most, and then just follow their careers and look for the big finals they played, look for the classic matches they played. So I would go down some of the players I enjoyed, like Cooler, mastermind player, also got his skills to a very high level and well-rounded, played through basically like 2 or 3 generations worth of Quake players, and was still a champion level player, still plays to this day. Another player still active, in fact these first 4 are all active, would be Rafa. True mastermind, doesn't have the same skills in a game that people think are skill biased, but incredibly smart about the game, has matched up with practically everyone in the history of the game well, many times champion in all versions of Quake he's played. Cypher might be the most skilled player to ever play Quake, and is a champion, and has a very interesting matchup with those 2 players I've just described earlier. Tends to, in history, have a back and forth with Rafa and beat Cooler most of the time. Rafa and Cooler tend to have a very even matchup. Then there's the 4th member of that like sort of 4-man god lineup from Quake Live, which is obviously Avec. This is the big 4. Very, very aggressive player, a very fiery personality, very defined style of play, but when it works, as you saw recently, you played Cooler, it looks just fucking absurd how strong he is. If you want to go with old school names, 04 and Fatality were 2 very great Quake champions in the early 2000s who had some classic matches. So yeah, I would just pick out players you enjoy and then start following out from there. Branch out and find the other ones and watch all the great games of their careers. Ass Blaster 2000 says, what are the key differences between the NA scene in League of Legends compared to CSGO? Specifically in how the NA CSGO scene has a way bigger presence on the world stage and creating top tier talent. Would NA be in a similar place if Korea and China were more relevant in CSGO? I'll answer the latter part first. Yes, I do think they would be in a similar place, but I don't think they'd be in the same place. So I do think, for example, that NA as a region would be third or fourth in the world, as it probably is in League of Legends, if Korea and China were massively invested into CSGO and basically the kind of people who play League of Legends now instead played CSGO. I do think that Korea and China would be strong competitors for first. I think it's a different enough game from League of Legends that just as now the best League of Legends team from Europe competes and sometimes is better than the best Asians, I think that would happen with the elite European teams, the Astralises of the world, etc., even given a few years for the Asians to catch up. So I think it would be different in the whole scene anyway. And as a result, similarly, I actually think just as because of how the game's changed, Team Liquid was able to beat IG in that series and go to the final of MSI, which would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. I think also the best NA team, a Team Liquid and EG, would also be able to compete. They could be a top 10 team. They could get in the mix there and have an amazing run and be a top 4, maybe even win the odd event. I do think they'd be worse though, and they'd win a lot less. Another reason why I think NA would be better in CSGO is I think in terms of like macro decision making, it exists in CSGO, and I would say tactics are something akin to that. But raw fragging can get you a lot more done in CSGO than I think raw skill and mechanical skill can in League of Legends. So I think NA has some fantastically skilled players that could do a lot more in CSGO than they could in League of Legends as an engine. I also think the fact that NA players are trapped over in NA and don't travel internationally all throughout the year means they don't get as much experience playing the top teams, including the Asian teams, whereas the NA teams in CSGO, Team Liquid and AG have played the top European teams a billion times. They don't have fear because of that. They might have fear they're going to lose the game, or this guy's got inside my head psychologically, but not just because they've never played them. Like, oh, they're unattainable Euros, in the way that does happen to Westerners if they have to go against top Asian players. Someone like Vulcan, he doesn't play against the fucking Shy in best of fives. Like, he has never experienced that, so he might not be ready for that for all we know. He might not be comfortable when he's put in that situation. I also think as well, the fact that NA players outside of LCS then have to practice on solo queue with high ping and all that stuff. I think that's also worse. Just because you travel so much in CSGO and you go to Europe so much in CSGO and you can boot camp more in Europe, I think that also raises your level, gets you more comfortable with your opposition, and means your end results will be better. So I think it just makes sense to me. Peyton Lee Trahan says, hey Thorin, what in your opinion makes the European scenes in esports much stronger than the North American? So similar topic. Let's see. Well, one thing I'll tie into the last question is, first of all, there is no massive Asian scene in many of the games. So I think it also makes Europe look like, because they're the best, they're just the best in the whole game. No. I think as you've seen in games like Dota, etc., and League of Legends, the Asian regions tend to produce more top players because of a mixture of work ethic, mentality towards money, how they'll just drive each other and don't have the same social concerns about mental health, etc., and burnout and things that now in the West we tend to care about. Just less individualistic in general, I'd say, as a people, and so more dedicated to the craft and the duty of being in a top team and being a top player. Some of these factors. But if we want to go with European versus North American, like, first of all, we're skimming the cream off the top when we talk European. Like, we're mainly talking Nordic, right? So in League of Legends, it's obviously like Denmark. In CSGO, it's Denmark now, but it was traditionally Sweden, Denmark. And yeah, beyond that, there's some other good countries, but they're not like monsters to the same degree. So it definitely helps having the Nordic countries. Take the Nordic countries out of the equation. Give me only UK, Germany, Spain, France. Listen, it'll be good, but there'll be a lot more parity between NA and Europe, in my opinion. So Nordic region helps immediately. I'll throw in many of the Nordic regions, the social safety net, as they call it, the welfare system, the fact that school's often paid for, mean you can sort of fuck around, take sabbaticals, not go to school, quit school, and take esports up as a professional in a way that's a bit more of a gamble. I think if you come from the US, my own home country of the UK, etc., I think that certainly plays a factor. You can essentially just fuck around and know that your life isn't over if you mess it up after that year. What else would be another factor? Oh, I mean, one factor that's come up on talk shows a lot, so I'll bring it up now, is I actually think the fact that so many Americans who are pros are nerds, but in the negative sense, like they're the guys who are quiet, or they can't handle people talking in a harsh way, or they lack social skills. I think that has actually hurt NA esports a lot. That when I talk to coaches and players, there is a lot that goes into their environment that's about, like, no matter, even if you're right, don't be an asshole. Like, don't upset the guy's feelings. Be very careful. Have kid gloves around these people. Or maybe you shouldn't be the one to give the criticism. You should give it to your coach and he can give it in a one-on-one later. In Europe, people tend to be a little bit more blunt, a little bit more in each other's faces. The players run things a little bit more and they resolve their issues. So in teams like G2, OG, etc., they just argue and shit gets figured out, and they get things. I'm talking about OG with Amazing and Mithy and Swaz and Expect, etc. I think that's actually it's not the best way to solve problems, but for certain types of people, it's going to be a lot more effective than I go into this room, you go into this room, let's all calm down, then let's meet up and talk and by committee figure this out. That's going to work for some people as well, but I don't think in terms of competition, as far as I know, that it works as well. I think when you watch things like The Last Dance and you see what assholes some of the best players ever can be, some of the best competitors, you see that there is a fairly strong correlation between being a bit of an asshole and being incredibly demanding in all other areas. Usually it just means you're very demanding as an individual and of other people because you're driven to win. So I think there is a correlation, and I think Europe tends to embody that or be allowed to embody it more than North America does. And then North America seems to be a little bit more comfortable with this fucked idea of like, well, I got a lot of money and fame and I have some success or I'm good in my region, so who really cares if I'm good internationally? Like, I've always thought that's whack. Think about all those European players you've heard turn down offers to join bigger teams for more money and play in the LCS and still go to Worlds because they think if they can get top 3 in Europe, they have a better chance at Worlds. They have a better chance to maybe win Worlds now, thanks to what G2 did. That is a big difference in mentality right there. Like I've said in the past, I mean, I don't even know if the opportunity is there right now, but I would like it if the Doublelifts and Dardoks of the world go to Europe. If you want to win and you want to be a top player and you want to be in an environment where people will appreciate that instead of pushing back on your personality or how abrasive you are, I'd say go to Europe. Like, it's the place for you. People will love you there. You'll also be an enormous star, by the way, and you might even be able to win Worlds or something crazy. The big one says, what was your reaction to Xavier's involvement in match fixing when it first broke out? So we're talking early 2010 when Xavier, one of the bourgeois and one of the very best StarCraft Brood War players of all time, one of the best RTS players of all time, it came forth. He was involved in a match-fixing scandal where supposedly he himself didn't throw any games. I saw some games where I suspect he threw them personally, but they did nail him on the fact that he supposedly encouraged others, most notably those fucking Height Sparkies guys have all got fucking shit canned and the whole team got shut down. He got these guys involved with doing it. So my reaction was this. One, it's very sad in as much as this was a truly great competitor in esports history, and they did do incredible things in the game, and then also they did something criminal, but even worse, that impacted what was going on in the game. And as I said, I suspect they also in the game spoiled the competitive integrity of their professional matches to take part in matching. That is shameful, that is atrocious, and I thought as much at the time. So my reaction was shock, was dismay. I actually feared for what it would happen to the game even, because Korea is an honour-based culture. So having the game itself be dishonoured, I thought, fuck, they're not just going to close this shit down, or the government's not going to step in and do something, are they? And all this like regulation and some. I was actually quite concerned. I was also quite saddened at the response of the public and the Kesper, it's like Korean hegemony basically, which was they just focused only on the crime and only on the bad thing. And so, for example, they literally deleted from history what he'd accomplished, like he'd won these championships, and fans started to say that you should never mention him, you shouldn't be allowed to talk about him, like he's scum, let's forget everything he ever did. Like, I think that sucks. I don't think you should ever do that in terms of great accomplishments. I don't think it makes any sense to do it. This is going to sound like hyperbole, but it would be like if someone found the cure to cancer and it later turned out he was a real asshole as a person and scammed on his taxes. Like, should we then not use the cure to cancer? No, that would be a ridiculous premise, right? So why should we not still be able to have the same place in history for their accomplishments, to appreciate what they did do despite their flaws? Zale asks, what are your thoughts on the situation where a C9 employee posted a tweet calling out Santorin and other players, pro players, racist for choosing the police Volibear skin in an LCS game? Do you agree with how the community responded and or C9 Jack's official response? Right, so first of all, what do I think of the situation? I thought it was really inappropriate, inaccurate, and I mean, I would say it's silly, but it's actually quite a damaging thing to do, just call people racist in that way and to potentially draw ire towards them for something that I don't think was justified. I think it was a massive overreaction by that person. I actually genuinely, I'm not exaggerating, I would actually genuinely counsel, if I knew that person, to maybe go and get some sort of help. I won't say like psychiatric help. I don't know which one of those things actually help you and which ones are good for you. I would just say like it suggests to me maybe something's building up in your real life or your reaction to current world events that's making you lash out or behave in an irrational manner. I would say to genuinely consider this a red flag and maybe go and seek help, even just seek time talking to family members, trusted people, talk it out, see what the issue is. And then think again about the consequences of what happens if you call something like this out. Like, someone would have had to do something pretty racist to call them out publicly like that, in my opinion. So the fact that you call out these pro players for just using a skin with the most tenuous, I would say non-existent link to the topic at hand, I do think that's kind of outrageous. In terms of how the community responded, I mean, there was obviously a massive backlash against it. So I agree that there was backlash. I agree that people didn't want to go along with it and they thought it was bullshit. In terms of the whole angle of like, I mean, I didn't check this, but I've no doubt people just spam that person with tweets and say like, shut up, idiot, like, fuck you. As usual, I've no doubt that happens. So I'm not in favour of that person. Like, I don't control other people's accounts. They can do what they want, but I personally wouldn't engage in that. I don't like that we have a community. It's just a group of people that do that sort of thing. In terms of Jack's response, I thought he did a very good job in terms of professionally handling it. My problem is just this. I'm skeptical he would have done the same thing if it was a player who was getting in trouble for like a small joke or something. I don't know if he would have been quite as lenient. And it didn't appear as though the person actually got any proper punishment. I think that's the big concern that some people had. I don't necessarily know whether they should be fired. Like, if they apologise for it and they agree not to do it again, I don't think everyone's job should be taken for such fucking minor things. Are they good at their job? If they're good at their job, let them keep doing their job. Just ask them not to tweet about it publicly and give them a punishment. In this case, probably a slap on the wrist, and ask them to apologise to Santora and the pro players. That would be my approach. So I sort of agree and I sort of don't agree. Like, I'm not sure. I don't know behind the scenes, but I don't think he probably was as harsh behind the scenes as I might have been. I'm not certain on that one. But then again, like I say, I'd always rather err on the side of caution, give people the benefit of the doubt, as unfortunately this individual didn't about other people. But I don't know them beyond that. I won't cast any aspersions on them as an individual. Scatman in Bed says, Hi Thorin. I've always been a fan of players who clearly had the skill, but never had the consistency to be a superstar. Players like AZ, Nex, and Nothing. In your opinion, what held these three back, and what could they have done differently to possibly be world beaters? Right, first of all, I think you've nailed it with your characterization. I would agree. All three of those players, for Nothing, it's more 1.6, but he's still a pretty good CSGO player early on. AZ and Nex, I think these are all three players where they have much better skill, in line with what you're saying, than their status or even the position they played in their teams often. Like, before he joined G2, which then became FaZe in 2015, AZ was a top 3 Danish player. He was a fucking monster, and his skills were bonkers back then. He was a really strong player when he was under MSL in that Dignitas team. It's funny, MSL also had Kirby at a level. Kirby, in terms of consistency for months, never played out ever again in his career, even when with MSL again, just like AZ. So it's interesting that they come to MSL, he sets them up, they become these stars, they go elsewhere, and they come back somewhat broken or damaged goods, and they're never as good even when MSL gets them back. So I think that was a factor already, that these guys, in terms of AZ and Kirby, who weren't in your mix, but I'm putting them together for a second, that they went off and were coached by other people, led by other people, had to, due to individual form dropping, change their style of play. I don't think that helps. So for AZ, well, for all three, it's essentially mentality. Like, all three of them, I don't think had a true star player's mentality, and certainly didn't have the confidence in themselves of a star player. In terms of individually, I think for AZ, like I said, he got ruined by the bad G2. It was the one where, if you remember, they had Jacom, and the Jacom was shit in the bed for months and months. They had no true IGL. They had Fox and Rain and those guys. It wasn't until Karrigan came along, and obviously he let AZ go out the door fairly quickly after coming in, that we actually saw them become a top team again. So I think he was just ruined by that team, unfortunately. And then on North, he's just been a different player, and he's been more of a supportive / middle of the pack element. Next, for me, it was largely just he'd had psychological issues in big stage matches. He was never as good, even in tier 2 lands or online games. He could be an absolute monster. I've heard so many great things from teammates in terms of scrims, but I've also heard a lot of frustration from teammates in terms of what he would be like in scrims, and then what he'd be like in a major or in a massive LAN where you have to perform. In terms of Nothing, I've brought this up in the past, but his biggest flaw from 1.6, when he should have blossomed into a superstar but didn't quite, was that even from early on as a pro, I'm talking about when he's in Evil Geniuses, he would say, I think maybe publicly, but certainly behind the scenes, that he wanted to be thought of as a well-rounded player. He wanted to be the guy who wins the clutches. He wanted to be a smart player. And I just got to tell you right now, that isn't who he was as a player back then. He was more, if you follow like League of Legends, or even I'll give you the CSGO example, he was more like a Stewie 2K or a Blabber. He was someone whose skill set was best suited, where he used his pretty good raw skill to couple it with pure aggression, take a lot of the decision-making out of the equation, just make space for people, attack, cause chaos, tear up defenses, and then everyone else follows you up. Instead, he decided he wanted to be more this well-rounded player, play the other end of the spectrum. Essentially, a guy who should have been Rui tried to play like Conte. So I think he actually ruined his game to some degree in that sense. And then in CSGO, I just never got the vibe that he was actually into it as a pro in the same way as some of the absolute best players were. I think he just enjoyed a mixture of fame and streaming, and he was good, but was he that good? And how did he think of himself? I mean, I think at that point in time, too many years ago, and the rot had set in to some degree. So I think that's basically it. So if I had to go then on the last part, what held them back, but also what could they have done differently? I think if you'd have kept AZ with someone like Karrigan, he could have done a lot, or he'd stayed with MSL the first time. I think, because obviously he would eventually have had a chance to potentially join Astralis, by the way, instead of a config or a Magisk. I think if Nex had just seen sports psychologist type people early on and attacked that problem really early on, because I talked to him and he said he'd never looked into that topic, and I don't know if he ever did, quite frankly. I've later on seen interviews where he implied he didn't think it was an issue, it was an overblown narrative. So I think there's the problem. Mentally, I don't think he ever attempted to fix it. And then in terms of nothing, I think he just needed the right mentor figure in 1.6 or IGL to tell him, like, fuck that. That's not who you are as a player. This is how I'm going to use you. And if someone had done that and he'd seen the results, I think then he might have actually been a different player. But again, these people had their own lives to live, and they chose how to live it. James P. What are the teams you'll be keeping an eye on after the player break? This is for CSGO. As a big fan of OG and EG, I will be looking to see if they can keep up their recent improvements. I'm with you on the EG one. I think they've looked so much more revitalized since Zeus joined. I love that they're back on Inferno and that they're banging everyone on that. So that's a very interesting team. I'm looking forward to them in general. Always been a team I've enjoyed watching. I think two of the teams that came up recently but haven't done it on land properly in terms of like winning tournaments, obviously Big and Col. I want to see how both those teams do. I feel like Col have got the better basis for the long term, but I feel like if you went offline tomorrow, Big could be like the 6th or 7th best team in the world. They could be a real dark horse for events. So I want to see if they can continue any of their form online. I think probably the two best teams in the game right now, realistically, are probably Vitality and G2. And if you look overall over the last few months, because of Charles' issues, Na'Vi trapped in their region, shit in the bed, Mouse and Fnatic falling off a cliff, I think realistically they're just the two best teams. It's just that, first of all, they haven't been able to win events, so that makes them compelling right then. And then also they have such different contrasting strengths, right? Vitality relies so much on Ziwu, and then the rest of the players playing around him, and now having a pretty decent map pool. G2 has more of a black and white map pool, but have a couple of maps they're very strong on, and their fragging can be really nice, and obviously Kenny S is very good, but isn't Ziwu. So I think those are two teams I'm very fascinated to watch. I just enjoy watching both play for different reasons. And then I'll also throw in, I want to see how Furia does, because I think that they might have actually cooled off over this online era, or just played the other teams too much and trained those other teams to how they play, because they went from like winning a lot of narrow games and therefore always placing highly to having a lot of results where it's like they lose the narrow game now or lose the OT game, or the same opponent that they've beaten many times finally scores a win over them. So I have my concerns in that regard. Yona Leesti says, how do you feel about people always discarding the importance of existence and his obvious strategical mind? How do I feel about it? I mean, I think it's just very disappointing. I think it's quite sad that people will just dismiss somebody who's had an incredibly impactful, prolific esports career. I get when people don't know source, that's one thing. But even in CSGO, this guy had 2 or 3 years where he really had a massive impact on the game. He was one of the best strategical IGLs in the game. So I think it's sad that people would ignore history, but I think it's even more tragic because existence to me, it reminds me before Device had won the 3 or 4 majors, right? When Device was one of the best players in the world in 2015, people would downplay him constantly, even in his own team, because people knew he was one of my favourite players. He had to basically win so many championships and MVPs that it was undeniable. And even then, people have been trying to give those MVPs to everyone else in the team except him. People have been trying to find a reason as to why it's the whole team of stars, not him. So if you haven't noticed, anyone I really like in my career, people always downplay or are way more likely to be critical of than they do the other names. Like, think about how much criticism Simple used to get before 2018 for being easily one of the best players in the world, and then how little criticism someone like Forrest gets in the last couple of years. He's significantly worse player the last couple of years, contrasted to that period of time. Unfortunately, anyone I really like, they have to overwhelmingly break through before they truly get their due. Same with Elige for a number of years. Motherfuckers in 2017 were telling me Stewie 2K is better than Elige. Child, please. I think I was not only proven right by history, but just go and look with your eyes at the time in the game. Shoot 2K's year was the year before, for fuck's sake. So I think Existence, sadly, because he hasn't had much success in the latter years of CS, he's now just become solely someone who's now hindered by the fact that he was one of my favourite players. So yeah, I find that pretty sad, actually, mate. Istar says, what is your opinion on esports teams seeking pandemic financial relief within the US? He's talking here about orgs, for example. He says specifically, as most of them are orgs that have stakes in either Overwatch or COD leagues or both. So let's just be real. Any organisation that has an Overwatch League spot, an LCS or LEC spot, or a CDL spot, and then applies for a small businesses loan, I think on the surface of what the words small business loan mean, they are disingenuous, and I actually find that quite obnoxious. Like, it makes me feel a little bit sick when I think of that, especially when I think of some of the other people who might not be able to get money, who really need it, in a much smaller businesses. Because remember, these are companies sometimes owned by multimillionaires, sometimes owned by companies that are enormous, like Comcast, etc. So in this kind of scenarios, I find that kind of fucked up. I think it's disgusting, especially when the same companies then, last year and in future years, will slap their dick in your face all the time about how huge they are and the investment they've gotten, and then shove their ideology down your throat, and then they're going to turn around and beg the government for money to stay afloat. Nah, that ain't cool to me. Especially as you point out, they've gotten these slots in these massive leagues. They've overpaid. They've spent, quite frankly, frivolously for their business model, that money, thinking they would ever get a return on it, some of them. And now they're applying to the government and the taxpayer to bail them out, essentially, and keep them afloat. Yeah, that does make me feel a bit sick. Now, Richard had a video where he talked about it, and he made some decent counterpoints to that, but generally I'm just not a fan of it overall, especially because, like I said, these orgs will then turn around and flex on us all and show that they're sending people in private jets and buying them fucking champagne and all that, and then they're going to take that money from the taxpayer. Nah, that ain't cool with me. Jerky's Minion, my boy, says, which StarCraft player, his playstyle, did you like the most in Brood War? Ooh. See, I'm going to go in the sense of, like, if someone asks what your favourite movies are, I don't think actually you should say what you think the best movies of all time are, because maybe they're not your favourites and you wouldn't want to watch them often. But you go with the ones that you just really love and you can watch them all the time, and if they're just a slam dunk that you love them. So, in terms of, like, if I want to think intellectually, yeah, I love the way that, like, I Love Uve and Xavier just toyed with their opponents like a chess game, Flash, etc. But if I want to talk just raw, like what appeals to me and what I've always just loved to watch, the two names that come to mind would be Jaedong, the Zerg player, and Bisu, the Protoss player, and primarily Bisu. And the reason Bisu is because, like all great Protoss players, he always had to walk the line on his builds of being super efficient or cutting corners or taking massive gambles. So he would always look like, right up until the second he won, he could still lose the whole game and would be on the brink of losing and then would turn it and win the whole game. So I always just found that incredibly compelling to watch. And the more I watched the game and the more I found that race was just, in terms of how the game was built, not supposed to be capable of winning like many, many championships, and then he could do it. I think in some ways, when you actually like pro rata what race he played and the eras he played in, you could make an argument for Bisu as the best StarCraft RTS player ever. You could really do that, even though he didn't have the same number of championships as Flash, Jaedong, Nada, you know, a bunch of the great one, Moon, etc. So in terms of Bisu, he'd been on my number one, and he actually was my favourite player. And then in terms of playing style, you have to go with Jaedong as well, because Jaedong just has that super aggressive, like super clutch, cutthroat, killer style, where if he gets one opening, he just kills you. He'll just end the game immediately. Like, I've always thought that was amazing to watch. A really, really entertaining play and a fabulous mentality to win, which is why it's so bizarre he won so rarely in StarCraft 2 after all those finals. Joe Simpson says, I didn't follow CSGO when Dazed was a professional, but looking back on matches, he seemed to frag very well, while most IGLs seemed to get some sort of pass to not land shots. Was Dazed a very good player in that regards? Does he have a ranking on any sort of top IGL list? Thanks. First of all, what you said is essentially the most famous thing about Dazed. He is the archetype of a fragging IGL, especially because in his era he's contrasted against Xinged, a very low fragging IGL. So I will say, going along with that, he was also more in the category of the Blame Fs and Nikos of the world, where they're fragging super well themselves and running more of a loose style of play where you have a lot of fraggers around you. It's not that they are then super tactical, but I do think compared to those players, Dazed actually had a better tactical mind though. He did have some good senses for it, but in similar, for me, he was more like an NA Karrigan, not in terms of the fragging, but in the sense that his style is like simple setups, read the opponents, and then find the openings and the matchups you want to create over and over again and win the game from doing that. Similar to how great basketball teams often will if they don't have an amazing coach, but they have some very good individual players. So I think he was very good in terms of fragging. It's also because he used to not be an IGL and was a pretty good fragger generally in the game, could even AWP, and put a lot of effort into it. I think he also positioned himself to frag well, and within his teams, didn't take any guff and think anyone could be a low fragger. I certainly don't think that he's like an indictment or he shows that it's wrong that IGL should get a pass. I think he was one of those exceptions that proves the rule, and actually the context of how he fragged makes more sense as to why he was able to. In terms of where I would rank him on an IGL list, he'd definitely be one of the greatest NA IGLs even to this day. He'd be top 5 easily, maybe even top 3 or top 2. So he'd certainly be up there. In terms of all the great IGLs in CS history, I mean, he's not going to make a top 10 list of that or whatever. So again, individual players of fragger, I mean, we can say if we're judging IGLs holistically, it counts for you. But then don't I also have to take points away if you're not as great tactically? So, it doesn't put you ahead of the others just because you're better fragger than overall if they have strengths elsewhere. Because it is the role of being a leader more than just a fragger. Spencer Green. In a Counterpoints episode, you and Moses discussed Valve making small changes being made on competitive maps in an attempt to freshen gameplay and strategies, and we've seen adjustments on Cash and Dust 2 recently. Has Valve made steps in the right direction, or is it too soon to tell? Could you elaborate on specific changes you would make to any of the maps? So basically, what we were talking about here was actually Moses' idea, which I think is a very interesting idea, which is that you keep the same basic maps, because they obviously work and we love them, and a lot of the newer maps, it's too much of a gamble to bring them in. But you just change the bomb sites around. So you change where the boxes are. You change where the bombs planting the bomb site. And that's how you freshen the game up. You keep the game alive. You make new things that you have to practice, new tactics. And I think it's a brilliant idea. I think it's one of the best ideas Moses has come up with. So I would like it if Valve had a team of map makers who they basically paid to do this, or even brought in some people from the professional esports scene who could give them some advice as to how to switch these up, or concepts behind what works in a bomb site. Maybe look at what works on certain bomb sites that are very popular on other maps and rework that into what's on one of these maps. In terms of Valve doing it, I don't think Valve did it on Cash. I would suggest FM Porn probably did there. So in terms of them doing it on Dust 2, I don't think the changes they did on Dust 2 or Mirage were that significant, really. There were a few minor ones. So do I want them to make changes and swap things up? Yeah, I think it's not bad. I don't mind it overall. I mean, I personally, with most maps, can get away with watching the same map for years and years and years. I've never had that big a problem. But I get why there's a positive that some people like, or there's an upside that some people want from that. So I wouldn't be against it, but I'd like them to have a team of people do it, not just some random Valve guy decides. Real M, or Realm, probably Realm, says, what do you think about Rainbow Six Siege's esports? Right, I've actually been asked this many times before, mate. And even though, as you point out here, you wonder why it's not a game I'm into because it has a steep learning curve, high skill ceiling, etc. I mean, the answer I've always given in the past is, right now, my main games I'm following day to day are League of Legends and CSGO, and they're such full-time games that I already feel like I don't watch as much League of Legends as I'd like to. I'd like to watch some more matches from some of the other regions than I get to at the moment. And I certainly can't watch some of the lesser teams play as a result of how much there is to follow. So I just don't have the time right now. With that said, I actually think it's a game I'm going to give a chance to for some of the big tournaments. I might watch some of the finals, and I'll see if it appeals to me in any way. Because now that I'm not going to be covering Overwatch much, and Quake just probably isn't going to be a big enough esport, I might actually delve a little bit into it. But I'm not going to promise anything. It's just going to be initially watching and seeing if I can fuck with it on that level. Then maybe I give it a try. Because like you say, it does have a lot of factors that, put it this way, as a game, I'm sure I would enjoy it more than League of Legends. So I might give it a chance. Hands on Keyboard says, hi Thorin, was wondering if you could give some examples of players who deconstructed their playstyle and game and built something new consciously, and if you had any stories of the difficulties of doing such. I know Nada did it twice in early Brood War and Flash when he had his second rise. Would love to hear some CS or LOL stories if you have any, thanks. Right, let me think. Deconstructed their playing style and built it new consciously. Right, I'm going to guess if you've watched enough of my content. Let me think. Who was this person I gave this example of? I'm sure I've given this example, probably even on one of these before, of how Steph Curry, the best three-point shooter of all time in basketball history, rebuilt his form of his shot with his dad over a summer. I think it was going from high school to college, I believe they said it was, and that it made him much worse initially, and then he looked whack, and it took him years to figure out, but then eventually it made him a better player in the long run. That's the problem with doing that style. So if you want to go for players who like consciously change their playing style, that's tough because there aren't that many anecdotes for that. But I would maybe say... someone like Jensen did that, because when he was Incarnation, that guy was the guy who was like a stud on shit like Fizz and Zed and just going ham in solo queue and carrying the game, like more of an Apto in that sense, like win the game and be the best smurfer / booster. But you see, when he's been at his best and for most of his LCS career, he's more of like a Froggen. He's more of like a control mage player. Even when he plays Assassins, he's a lot more risk averse than the really good assassin players typically, and he tends to be like, I think Larsen's maybe a comparison you could use for current players. Who gives a fuck about Froggen when he's in academy, right? So they tend to be a little bit more reserved in that regard, and it's more about control than it is about just outplaying the person Cap's style all the time or Expeke style. In terms of like StarCraft, let me think for that. I mean, when you say that Flash built his game for his second rise, I actually think a lot of people probably wouldn't even understand that. Like, one of the things he did in his second rise that's so impressive to me is that Flash stayed the course. So if you remember the way he lost the MSL final, where he was going for all of those macro game style, and Jaedong just beat him straight up. And then he came back the next season and lost the OSL final, playing against Effort, where he essentially lost 4 games out of 6 played, by trying to do super macro style, 14 CCing all the time and just inted games away. Now, you would think when someone tells you he won the championships after that and became the untouchable God King, he must have changed his style. No, that was the style change. He figured out that if Terran can play as greedy as possible towards the macro game, but survive by scouting or intuition, then they can just have, when you're someone like an I Love Uv or a Flash, you can just have an untenable constant advantage in the game, and it will be so hard for the other races to fight back against you. And so I think that's a good example, actually, someone rebuilding their game from the ground up, etc. I would say an example might be like Cooler in Quake 3 / Quake Live, because in the first Quake 3, before they all came back in 2008, Cooler was like Rafa is now in Quake. He was the guy who beat you with his brain, and he had the right mentality for it, and he was always in a match. He could do great comebacks, and he could control his opponents where they were on the map and set up favourable situations and then take the 60-40 or the 55-45 scenario. But Cooler in Quake Live knew he had to go head-to-head with Avec and Cypher. So this guy leveled his raw skills up, and he became actually one of the most dominant skill players. And he had a very strong LG, his plasma was sick, his rockets were really nice, his rail was one of the best in the game. Like, this guy really leveled his... It feels to me like he put in a lot of hard work to his raw skills, whereas when you look in Quake 4, when he's playing Toxic, Quake 3 when he was playing CZM and 0-4, etc. Those guys were more skilled than him. They had the better gun skills than him, and he had to beat them with his mind. In Quake, for me, he became one of the best just skilled players in the game. I think that was very, very impressive. In Counter-Strike, who can I think of who rebuilt their game? There's got to be some good ones here. I mean, an obvious example to me would be like Karrigan, because if people don't know, he was more of like a second star or the KGB third position player in 1.6, and then in CSGO he not only became an IGL, but he became not even like a fragging IGL necessarily, and he became an IGL where the way he's used his players, like top players, lesser talents but skilled players, like I think he's done a fantastic job with how he's used them, and a lot of that was obviously conscious, how he rethought his game, learned things from God B, looked at some of the other IGLs in the game and contrasted what was working at the time in terms of loose style and made that work. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good example. Right, Impulsive says, out of the philosophical works you've read, which ones have impacted your thinking and the way you model the world the most? Oh, this should be a whole video itself on my side channel, right? So maybe one day I'll revisit that. Someone remind me of that. So I'll just say, first of all, I think the philosophical ponderings of Christopher Hitchens through his work, particularly his essays, have had a large impact on me. Like different ways, like for example, he's someone who really made me see some of the pros and cons of the Hegelian dialectic and using that as a way to model the world history, interaction of ideas. That's been very fascinating to me. I think in terms of raw philosophical work, I've got to go immediately to like Nietzsche. What a fucking thinker that guy was on seemingly every topic under the sun. Even obviously eventually sometimes contradicted himself or changed his mind. I mean, he's someone I haven't even got to very close to the bottom of his work, not least because he's someone where to really appreciate him in a way that I can't, you have to also have studied the people that he's reacting to, responding to, trying to replace with historical thinking. I think in the modern day, when I've become more interested in like spiritual topics, I found like Heidegger a lot more interesting than I ever used to in the past. If we're talking philosophical, I actually like beyond his professional field, I find like the work, for example, in the Red Book of like Carl Jung very interesting. Again, I'm not going to go into all the ways these people have impacted my thinking, etc. I think for Nietzsche, it's the being willing to be an iconoclast, being willing to go back to first principles and tackle the big questions of all of human history, life itself, never to think that you can't yourself come to conclusions or study something or figure it out for yourself. In fact, I'd say in esports, where that helps me is one of the reasons I'm willing to do a piece as bold and as brave as the best Western player ever and take all the slings and arrows and people tell me I'm an idiot and abuse me and be shitty to me and downvote it, is because I think it's bullshit that other people don't feel, people who might know more about League than me don't have the balls to go and do that because they're afraid of the backlash, because they don't think, well, I haven't watched every VOD, so how can I possibly answer that? I'm willing to tackle the big topics. That's one of the things I liked about Nietzsche, that he thought that he had the confidence to take them on in that regard. Marcus Aurelius, obviously, for all the Stoicism, classic one there. I've always been quite a fan of the thinking of Voltaire in terms of, again, an iconoclast, someone who's willing to speak out about topics, someone who's quite shrewd in terms of looking at the way that dynamics work in terms of power and politics and the world in general, and consider these factors and go back and forth with people. So there's quite a few. In terms of like specific books, I'd have to really do a whole video for that one. Like, I don't think books are that interesting if you just saw some of the title of a book. I think you have to really go into why you fuck with the book, what the aspect is, etc. Nicholas Ryback says, hey Thorin, thoughts on the death or decline of FPS as a genre in gaming and esports? What features of developer support could a new FPS use to become at least a tier 2 esports? Thanks. Right, I've obviously discussed this many times as well, because it's typically people asking me like, can Quake ever be a big game? Will Quake Champions be a big game? And I always say no, and I have a video that explains why, basically. So obviously, like, Counter-Strike's an FPS, it's a very popular genre. Fortnite's in FPS, but I know what you mean. Like, basically, my issue is it has to be developer support. I think it has to be a mixture of two things. One, developer support, but stop using things yourself. Like Basada themselves doing it. No, give that money to ESL and the others and have them run your tournament circuit, but give it to enough so that you get, like, say 10 big tournaments in a year or 5 majors in a year or something cool like that to keep the scene healthy. Secondly, like I've pointed out before, I'd like it if we went back to an esports model where we actually sort of, in the same way as back in the day for movies, you would have a double bill. I'd like if we went back to that for esports, where we have events that aren't just for one game. They cover a couple of different games, and so they encourage you to watch the other games sometimes if there's a boring game in the game that you're following. So I think Quake or a StarCraft or something like that could have a very vital spot as the second game that everyone watches as their overlap game that goes along with a big main game that you don't have to necessarily follow, and that could be a way to keep it alive. And then going along with that, I think there has to be a pay-per-view option, maybe even for the tournaments. I mean, I know I personally would support, I'd pay like maybe even $100 a month if it was right circuit. So I think something like that could maybe keep it alive. In Panic, or In Pan-EC, says, since the perfect Karrigan team question came up last time already, I have another interesting angle on that one I was hoping you could give us some insight on. In past teams, he had a lot of problems with teammates starting to distrust his calling, etc. Do you think he would benefit from having someone else being the captain while he is the IGL? Or maybe even a strong voice that rallies the troops like it was supposedly with Freakazoid and Sean Gares? For some reason, I immediately had to think of Blame F. Thank you. Right, I think there's a few ways to attack this. So first of all, I'll take yours on. Basically, in terms of if he had someone else who was the captain, now, Karrigan himself is a good captain. So I sort of do agree. Like, I would say maybe within Mouse he has Chris J to help him with that angle. But I do agree with you. I think within FaZe and within Astralis, he never had those. And in my opinion, in those teams, as soon as Nico, Device, maybe Dupree, as soon as these players question you and don't agree with what you're doing, I think you're basically done already. Your days are numbered at that point in time because they're not going to be the player that gets kicked because they're still the best. You're going to get kicked. So I think the fact that people distrust his calling even makes sense. His calling is around him and his intuition, his mind so much that if they're losing the game, it's easy to look at that and say he might be in bad form. That's why I've always said I sort of understand why Nico kicked him from FaZe. I just don't get it because there wasn't anyone better coming through the door. That's my problem. But I do think that actually, yeah, you had to break apart somewhat unless you changed some of the other players in FaZe. So having a captain would be a good angle. I think another approach that he should take is maybe have the coach be someone more like that. As far as I know, Raging's done a good job of that, but I don't think actually that Robban and Zonic were maybe the best fit for him overall in that regard. Zonic isn't that. Zonic is a good IGL tactically and a good coach tactically, but Karrigan already had that covered. And then I think Robban was too much more there just to deal with the Nikos of the world and was like a friend to the players, not a captain. I would say another angle you could take is I would like him to take on board people. Like if he took on board a Blame F, I'd like him to take them on board, but have them as the secondary caller. So he calls most of it, but they contribute an idea. And then the two of them combined as a brain trust means there's also less people to lose trust in you and more people who know what's going on in the game. And that could help much in the same way as Zonic was to Ave in 1.6 or DSM was to Khan in 1.6. So Hotwire with a 1 says, what happened to the Thorin versus X series? Can we expect any more? Yes, that is a series I am always thinking about bringing back, and I have some plans for it coming up soon. It's more just finding a good theme for it. If people want to suggest them, by the way, as long as you're in one of the tiers that you can suggest it, go ahead and suggest stuff. I'll take it on board. I'll think about it. I'm a lot more active now. In terms of like Thorin versus Reddit, I might not do as many of those, but I think I will bring some back. But I'm going to make the focus more on making it fun and it being entertaining than just bashing idiots. Because like, just generally, I think that kind of negativity, it's not that it doesn't have a place. It's just for me, it's not as interesting anymore. And I'll certainly do it sometimes if it's funny. A Crunchy Captain says, if Skadoodle had gone out with grace and retired after the Boston Major, where would you rank him in terms of all-time CSGO AWPers? Right, just to clarify here, mate, him playing after that doesn't at all affect where I rank him in terms of all-time AWPers. Like, him playing games extra and being bad doesn't make him go down on the list. Him not playing wouldn't have put him higher on the list. Like, we're not talking just his peak. So, in terms of all-time AWPers in CSGO, off the top of my head, the problem is, I don't count Simple as number one in AWPing in the true sense of it. So I personally would probably, as just a loose one, would probably go like Kenny S number 1, Guardian number 2, number 3, Device. Who would be number 4 after that? Because Simple probably does need to be top 5 still. So maybe Skirdle number 4. I mean, he was a very good player at one point in time. He had a very strong career and did a lot of great things. So Fallen probably has to be in there as well. I think him and Fallen around 4 and 5, they'll be around that point in the category. So I think he was a great player in 2014. He was a very good player in 2015, even greater. 2016 he fell off. 2017 he was appalling. And 2018 he was a bomb by then. I mean, listen, he had a really great performance at the Boston Major in the final, but only in the final. And just go and look at his numbers in the final and then look at how they affected his average for that tournament. And you'll see that even then he was pretty overrated and there's no university should have been winning the MVP unless it was only a finals MVP. Kristen says, what is your opinion on Broxer this split? He has a 42% first blood percentage, this is a few weeks ago, as of the stats on Oracle's Elixir on the 21st of July, which would be 7th in the league. He's also typically down in gold, CS, and experience at 10 minutes. He also only has a 67.1% kill participation. The only active jungler below him is for Sven Skaren. However, TL is 10-2, so is Broxer just playing his role in the team, doing intangible things stats can't tell. Or do you think he is significantly underperforming? Right, I've already addressed this on some talk shows, but I'll go into it some more. I do actually think he's an example of a player on a team that's one of the top teams that isn't very good at his role and is below average at his role. So I think it's very rare you get this happen. I think actually examples would be like Nemesis on Fnatic. And that's been the case like in the first split he played, for example. I didn't think he was a top 2 mid at all. Don't think he was even top 3 maybe. So I do think he is actually not doing much in that team. I think they just have such good individual players across a bunch of the positions and some very strong players like Korjaji and Jensen. And then Impact's just so good at his own specialty that I think that's allowing them to win. I think he's having very little to do with it. I think he's not doing much on the map. I think he's getting carried. I'll just say it outright. I think he's a cool guy, but I think he's getting carried in the game. I think he was somewhat carried in Fnatic, and that Hylissang massively made up for him in terms of the game, and that Whippo helped him a lot. I think Youngbuck made all the band-aids to allow him to be successful. So I have massive questions about him as an individual player. I don't think he should be on a team as good as a Team Liquid or a Fnatic, etc. I think he should be on a team like CLG. Or, I mean, they're now the top team in Europe. The old Splice. He could have been a player on a team like one of these, like this kind of a level, or Schalke. That's the appropriate level, in my opinion, for a player like him. Not a top team. I don't think he has the wherewithal. And I don't think he's even that good at being a dog. Like, he doesn't have a good enough champion pool. And you need at least even some smarts to know what to do when you're the dog and the guy just tells you where to come. So I have my questions about him a lot. And I can see where you bring up all these points. And very, I think the stats are apt to point out in this case. Right, Konzi asks, how much credibility does winning a major bring a player? And in context to this, let's say hypothetically, one of the Boston 2018 C9 players, Tarek, Stewie 2K, Rush, Automatic, obviously left Skrill because Skrill's retired, win a second major with their respective teams. So respective, I believe he means as in the teams they're on now. So like, obviously, it would be Complexity for Rush, it would be Genji for Automatic, it would be Team Liquid for Stewie 2K, and it would be Evil Geniuses for Tarek. If they win a second major with their respective teams, where would this put them in standings for one of the best players in NA history? Or would it merely be a case that they would be hailed instead as of the most decorated players in NA history? Simplified example being, perhaps Elige is the best NA player of CSGO arguably, but with no major title, to in this case, let's say, Tarek/Stewie, who would hypothetically be in this case, have 2 major titles. Right, the end part actually clarifies it quite a lot, because I will tell you right now, I don't use individual team accomplishments to judge individual characters in that harsh a manner. Like, for example, the fact that Stewie 2K and Tarek won a major doesn't put them ahead of Elige, and didn't even when they won the major. Not least because, in the case of Stewie, he wasn't even a star player for my money when they won that major. For me, the best player of that major for C9 was probably Tarek or Automatic. So if Tarek wins again, if he's in Evil Geniuses, he's not going to be a star player, so it won't add much to him being like an even greater player, or add a little bit as a team success. If Stewie won one, also wouldn't add to much. Like, I think it would make him one of the better role players in history, maybe the best NA role player in history because of the accomplishments and the different teams he did it with. But yeah, I'm not someone who puts the major as the main factor. Like, winning the major doesn't automatically give you like a credibility or a respect in some other way. Like, there's many players from NA that never won majors that I think are way better than Rush, for example, over their careers. So I would say, yeah, it would put them more in the decorated category. That would be the way you'd say it. I don't think they'd necessarily be much higher up as the best players in history, unless they play as stars, because I give the success to the stars. I think that's the big thing that makes you a great player in history, not just winning championships. But anyway, I like that you added the clarity on there. Justin Reed says, thank you for all the great content, and a question I've wanted to ask you is based on my future career. I won't say what it is there because I don't know if he wants me up this public, but he basically wants to know how you would talk to students that wanted to play esports professionally about getting into the scene and how to maneuver the difficulties a young pro might face. Right, what I would say here is go and listen to the interview. I'll link it if I can find it. Well, actually, I'll have to put it in the description box. An interview I did on a woman called Carol Roth's business podcast, where I actually, towards the end, give sort of advice as to what parents should think about, how you should think about their kids, like whether you should go pro or not. But I'll add into that, once you get to the pro level, you should immediately be trying to find a lawyer, 100%, and maybe an agent, and paying those people whatever fee or percentage they want to be able to give you contracts, look through contracts, check all these details. I would say that's a massive issue right there. And if you're a parent, that's how you can be responsible, is to help them out with that. Just get it for them now and get them, and make sure it's someone legit. And I would say in terms of some people, maybe don't even make it someone in esports. Like maybe have a real lawyer that you retain for your family or whatever, or use anyway, that you know is really legit, has very good accreditation. And then also maybe get a second opinion from an esports lawyer. So that way you don't have to worry that the esports lawyer is not as qualified, or not as good at his job, or corrupt in any way, because obviously some of them have certain conflicts of interest, right? So I would say that's one of the things to do, and I kind of addressed that elsewhere. Right, that's it for this episode. There will be a new thread. It'll be in the description box of this video, and it'll already be up. Submit your questions immediately. We'll obviously get some of them in before people get charged for next month. And then actually I'm going to get this one done fairly quickly in the next couple of weeks, and then I'll get the next one out. Another question thread in, say, 2 or 3 weeks. This video was kindly supported by Jack Hanna, Dean Tanglis, Soliko, Bobby, Spencer Green, Istar, WhattaThings, Xinged, Alexander Rao, Tobias Bernasconi, JDubs, the Puyallup Tribe, Jensen Goh, and of course, a special thanks goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you'd like to ask a question in one of those monthly video AMAs I do. Do you want teasers? See who the upcoming guests are for my work? Maybe you want to be part of one of those donator discussions with me each month. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today by the description box link to Patreon below.